תודה רבה לחגית, והנה עוד סיבה כמה נעים לנו פה באוניברסיטה הפתוחה, שמענו, ובהמשך לדבריה של חגית על האופי המגדרי המיוחד של האוניברסיטה הפתוחה, המושב הראשון שלנו כולו מן המין הנכון, 3 חוקרות מובילות, כל אחת בתחומה. המושב הראשון שלנו מתכבד לפתוח בהרצאה של פרופסור אלישבע קרליבך, שבאה אלינו במיוחד מארצות הברית, אתמול הגיעה, והיום היא כבר תרצה כאן במכון. פרופסור קרליבך היא מופקדת הקתדרה על שם סלו באון להיסטוריה, חברה ותרבות יהודית באוניברסיטת קולומביה. היא חוקרת פורצת דרך, מוכרת, חשובה מאוד לתולדות העם היהודי, בעיקר בעת החדשה המוקדמת. כתבה על נושאים מגוונים, בין השאר על תופעות של מינות בעם היהודי בעקבות השבתאות. כתבה על המרת דת של יהודים בגרמניה. וספרה האחרון, Palaces of Time, Jewish Calendar and Culture in Early Modern Europe, יצא ממש לפני שנה, יצא לאור. ופרופסור קרליבך תדבר על Palaces of Time, the Jewish Calendar between Christianity and Islam. בבקשה.
תודה רבה וברוכים הנמצאים. אני מודה לאכסניה שלי, פרופסור בת ציון עיראקי קלורמן, שהזמינה אותי בשם האוניברסיטה הפתוחה, ולאורי קלט ולכל אלו שדאגו לקבל אותי בסבר פנים חמות ויפות. ההזמנה שלכם אפשרה לי לחשוב על הנושא שלי בכיוונים חדשים. אני מתנצלת מראש שאדבר באנגלית. בקיצור, אני פשוט רוצה להביע שכל חברה מארגנת את הזמן שלה בצורה אחרת. מתי היא מתחילה למנות שנים, הכרונולוגיה, מתי היא נחה, מתי חוגגת, מתי צמא, וגם הארגון הזה היה לנושא של תחרות ופולמוס במשך הדורות בין הדתות והחברות. וכך אתחיל באנגלית. In the middle of the 12th century, לספירה הנוצרית, a brilliant man made his way from the sunny climate of Spain around Europe and the Mediterranean, even reaching the cold and foggy shores of England. He was possibly the most scientifically literate Jew of his age, and we don't know exactly what he was searching for. His name was Avraham ibn Ezra, and he was a member of a very small club. Just a handful of men, all men, who wrote the first surviving treatises on the Jewish calendar, Sifrei Ibur, in the 12th century. He also wrote the first Hebrew work on the astrolabe, and was instrumental in introducing Indian numerals into the West. I don't know if you could see it, but the letters around are Hebrew. There are about 36 astrolabes that survive with Hebrew letters. I don't plan to focus on him in my talk, except as a symbol of a Jew caught between cultures. Spain in the 12th century stood between the rule of Muslims and that of Christians. Ibn Ezra's Sefer Ibur stood between that of Avraham bar Chia, who lived most of his life in a Christian milieu, and Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh of Rambam, who spent most of his life in a Muslim one. Ibn Ezra stood between his inherited Jewish tradition about the calendar, that it was a work of divine perfection given exclusively to the Jews. This is an image of Yisachar. It's a very common image in Sifrei Ibur, Sifrei Evronot that were illustrated, in which God gives the Chochmat Ha'itim, symbolized by the hourglass in his hand, to Yisachar, the son of Jacob. Another way of expressing that, you see the angel coming, bearing the equations that were supposed to help you figure out the calendar. So he's between this tradition and the works of the classical Greek scientists and Arab mathematicians, which implied that the Jewish calendar was far from exclusive. As these works filtered into Spain, they forced a critical rethinking among Jews who became familiar with them, and the burst of Sifrei Ibur was one way of confronting this challenge. Cultural knowledge regarding time came to be collected or aggregated into what we call a calendar, the luach. No calendar serves as an objective instrument for marking time, just as no map is objective. It doesn't depict a natural landscape without mediation. Both of them incorporate political agendas or religious worldviews into their representations. Calendars are living systems. They're constantly being modified and reshaped. Knowledge of the calendar circulates within every society in two forms or levels. The first contains all the knowledge needed to set the calendar and to configure it to natural rhythms. The cultural, religious, and historical data significant to that society, as well as the formula and algorithms, the astronomical facts, orbits of celestial bodies, the predictable cycles. This is such a complex body of knowledge. It is not easily mastered by the masses. It is by its nature restricted to an educated elite who sometimes guard it as a secret to leverage its power. For Jewish calendar lore, the term Sod HaIbur came to characterize this esoteric dimension, although that wasn't its original meaning. So here's an image of Rabban Gamliel HaNasi discussing a rule of calendation bequeathed by him to his family. It's a little difficult to read, but in the sefer that he's holding, you have the rule, Ein chidusha shel levana pachot michaftet yamim. This knowledge remained for a long time an orally transmitted and closely guarded secret called Sod HaIbur, or sometimes Sefer Avonot in Hebrew. In Latin, that body of elite knowledge was called the computus, and it too became a lavishly illustrated genre. The second form within which calendar knowledge circulates in a society, the popular face of that knowledge, rendered in concise and accessible format, is what we generally refer to when we say the luach. The reduction of all the formulas to a well-ordered, clear, simple, and accessible table that keeps all the members of society marching together in time. At this point in technology, when very few of us still use a paper calendar, right? Now we use our cell phones, we have it on our computers, it wouldn't be inappropriate to recall that the medium for this knowledge was never stable. Here's a medieval English clog almanac in which, this is a board, a wooden board in which every day is a little line or incision, and the chagim are symbolized by various figures. This is what the Native American Indians use. This is a Lakota winter roll to count the years, every year symbolized by one image. The Aztec calendar, which, as you know, is notoriously difficult to decode. Historian Natalie Davis describes the French peasant almanacs of the 16th and 17th century as being carved on a morsel of wood no bigger than a playing card. Calendars, then, contain a profound reflection of the society that creates them, both in their basic conception of time and in their more mundane and social functions. They remain at the very core of each of the religious cultures we're addressing today, and one of the profound markers of their difference. Jews, Christians, and Muslims focus their interaction with one another around their construction of time. This is a somewhat neglected aspect of their interaction, but it is precisely through these sometimes overlooked aspects of culture that we can gain new insight. As first Christianity and then Islam arose, each with roots in or relationship to Judaism, the Jewish calendar stood at the center of both of their engagement of how to deal with the question of time in their religious orbits. The calendar itself became the subject of polemic in the sometimes tense relationship between Jews and Christians and then Jews and Muslims. The architects of the Christian calendar specifically designed it to disengage from the Jewish calendar, to compete with it, and ultimately to supersede it. The story of how the birth, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus came to replace the major festivals of the Jewish calendar that commemorated the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the law at Sinai is well known. So here's an example of an English Bible. If you look at the arrow on top, you'll see the word Passover. That's the translation in the verse. But if you look at the bottom arrow where you see a commentary, it's Easter. These changes evolved over time, accompanied by dissension and resistance that lingered for centuries. They ensured the social segregation of the two religious communities and produced acute discomfort on both sides. The Christian Bible has almost nothing to say about the question of Jewish calendar observances, and the mandate to separate the calendars rests on two rather obscure statements in the letters of Paul. And here they are. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul says, "You observe days, months, times, and years." But it isn't even clear whether he's upbraiding them for observing pagan holidays or Jewish holidays. In his letter to the Colossians, Paul says more clearly now that they had embraced Christianity, "Let no man therefore judge you," he's talking to the Christians, "in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days." In other words, let nobody tell you Christians that you're not observing the Jewish calendar properly. But it wasn't really until the 2nd century that the church fathers began the task of establishing a truly separate calendar, fixing Sunday as the Lord's Day over the Jewish Shabbat, fixing the feast days, and inaugurating a long and bitter controversy over the date of Easter. This centuries-long dispute was crucial to the entire enterprise of the Christian computus. Were it not for the need to elude the Jewish calendar, the Christian could rest comfortably upon the solar calendar it had inherited from Rome. Christians have to know when Pesach falls out, because Easter may never fall out on that day. So they are always going to be dependent on the Jewish calendar. The Jewish response to the degradation of the Jewish calendar observances by Christians is a polemical reversal. In several versions of Toldot Yeshu, the Jewish counter-testament against Christianity from late antiquity, a Jewish secret infiltrator, a double agent, Shimon Kefa, tells the Christians, "Du'u, כי התלוי היה שונא של ישראל ותורתם, כמו שניבא ישעיה, חודשיכם ומועדיכם שונאה נפשי. והנה הוא מצווה עליכם שלא תחוגו את חג המצות, אך תחוגו את יום מיתתו. ובמקום חג השבועות, תחוגו 40 יום משנסכל ועלה לרקיע אחר כך. ובמקום חג הסוכות, תחוגו את יום לידתו, וביום השמיני ללידתו, תחוגו אשר נימול בו. So here we have a polemical inversion of what actually happened. This sharp level of polemic about the calendar never fully subsided. Jewish polemical writings from the medieval period are filled with sharply negative expressions regarding Christian holy days. We'll return to them. The rise of Islam brought another religion to grapple with the formation of a new calendar and the question of how to structure it. Although Islam arose much later than Christianity, the anxiety of influence is evident in the formation of the Islamic calendar as well. Scholars are divided about whether the pre-Islamic calendar used on the Arabian Peninsula had always been a purely lunar reckoning in which months and festivals always receded from one season to another, as it is now, or whether it began as a luni-solar calendar, similar to the Jewish one, with 13-month intercalations, a chodesh ibur, similar in structure to the Jewish calendar. If so, if it began very close in structure to the Jewish calendar, it was in the 10th year to the foundation of Islam that Muhammad is here depicted forbidding ibur, forbidding intercalation, as something that he writes perverts the natural order of time. This from a manuscript written in the 11th century by the one great Persian Muslim scholar, al-Biruni, the first non-Jew to write in great detail about the Jewish calendar. And this is the earliest surviving manuscript of it. It survives in Scotland, of all places, and it's illustrated. And it presents a prophecy from Yeshaya as being about Muhammad. So he takes a verse from Yeshaya 21, Lech ha'amed ha'mitzapeh asher ye'er yagid, v'ra'a rechev tzemed parashim, rechev chamor, rechev gamal, v'ikshiv kashev rav kashev. Vayan vayomer nafla bavel v'kol psilei Eloheh shibar la'aretz. In this chapter, God tells Yeshaya, place a watchman in the tower who will see a pair of riders, one on a donkey and one on a camel, announcing the destruction of Bavel. This image illustrates the watchman in the tower, the prophet Muhammad riding on a camel, and the Mashiach riding on a donkey. Needless to say, this is an appropriation not only of a Jewish text, but also of a standard Jewish iconography, of a Jewish image. Here is a later image from a Sefer Ibur in which the Messiah is riding on a donkey, but Muhammad is nowhere to be found. So you can see that sometimes the illustrators talk to one another in a hidden polemic that's hard to know if you just see one side of it. In his section on fasting, on Tzomot, Al-Biruni includes a fast that relates to the loss of the Aron HaEdut on 10th of Iyar. He describes the loss of the Ark of the Aron in Mishkan Shiloh and its effect on the high priest, on Eli HaKohen, who fell dead from his throne when he heard it. And you'll notice that Eli, who lays on the floor, is dressed in a Mongol costume. The artist portrays members of non-Muslim groups here as Mongols. In another image from this manuscript, Al-Biruni mentions the fasting on the 9th day of the month of Av to commemorate what he calls the conquest of the Beit al-Muqaddas and its destruction by fire at the hands of Bukhnetzar, clearly some perversion of Nebuchadnezzar. Both these events, the death of Eli HaKohen and the destruction of the temple, confirm that God has taken election and his word away from the Jews. It took a while for rabbinic Jews to realize, says Al-Biruni, that the Shomronim, the Samaritans in antiquity, deceived them by lighting fires on the mountaintops before they actually saw the new moon. It took a while for Christians to realize, he claims, that Jews deliberately tried to deceive them with regard to the true time of Pesach. Thus, in his account, both the rabbinic Jewish calendar and the Christian calendar are portrayed as easily manipulable and vulnerable to deceit. Given that both Christians and Muslims portray the Jewish calendar in a polemical and degrading fashion, it's not surprising that Jews respond in kind. In the tension-filled atmosphere of 12th century religious wars in Spain, each of the men we mentioned earlier, including Bar Chia and Ibn Ezra, wrote very unflattering words about the calendar of the other in their Sifrei Ibur. And they didn't write in Arabic, they wrote in Hebrew. They were not trying to convince the other side, but to convince Jews. It's apologetic, not polemic literature. Of the three Sifrei Ibur, Bar Chia's employs the sharpest tone. He compares the Jewish calendar based on the sun and the moon to others that were based entirely on one or the other. For example, he writes, "We don't know of any nation that counts according to the moon without taking the sun into account, except for the kingdom of Ishmael alone and those among other nations who enter into their ta'ut." Bar Chia continues with a savage characterization of Islam, perhaps a reflection on the recent wars of religion raging during the Reconquista in Spain. "We say that in the kingdom of Ishmael, they began this chronology from the sin of the evildoer who misled them." Bar Chia was no more generous in this chapter to the pagan nations who followed the purely solar calendar, and he launches into a polemical description of the Christian calendar. "The entire evil kingdom of Edom," he writes, "who count according to the Talui, compute most of their civil matters according to the solar calendar like the Greeks. However, they are forced to include some consideration to the moon to set their fasts and some of their calamities, Eidehem, the rabbinic dysphemism for pagan holidays, because they are like Israel in this counting." Bar Chia alleged that when the apostles went forth to proselytize, to make more Christians among the pagans, they allowed the pagans to retain their holiday of the winter solstice, yesterday's holiday, turning it from impurity to impurity and from sin to sin. Christians, mocked Bar Chia, were divided over the age of Jesus at his death, and they had to turn to the Jews to help them figure out their own cheshbon. Barchia shaped his treatise into an instrument of polemic, and he proudly staked a claim for the Jewish sages of old whose calendrical structure had withstood the test of time and comprehended both major cycles. This polemical imprint remained an enduring feature of Sifrut HaIbur through the early modern period. One would think that after the tension subsides of the medieval religious encounter, it would be relegated to memories of the remote past. But in the 16th century, the question of the calendar arose again to the forefront in Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, the commercial needs of the merchant colonies predominated, and the Western calendar was integrated for many purposes, even if the Muslim one was used for religious purposes. Here's a page from an Ottoman calendar from the early 20th century, in which you can still see reflected the many different religious traditions, including at the very bottom, the Jewish one. This inclusiveness may be one reason that there don't appear to be, and I'm not an expert in this, and somebody may correct me, to be as polemical responses to the Muslim calendar in this period as there were to the Christian at the same time. In the West, discussion over calendar reform raged for decades during the 16th century. When Pope Leo, in the early 16th century, wrote to potential participants in a church council about the need for calendar reform, he said the errors in the calculation of Easter gave Jews cause for ridicule, and this is in the 16th century. Regardless of whether it was just rhetoric or a true source of anxiety, the church was still professing concern lest its calendar fall short in Jewish eyes. When the reform was finally pushed through by Pope Gregory in 1582, and here is an example of a new calendar printed in 1582 in which it says, January this year will only be 21 days long. Only the Catholics followed at first, but Jews followed the debates very closely, as this Sefer Evronot from 1582, the first year in which there was a new calendar, if you look at the very top line, it reads, Elu hasimanim shayachin lanai calendar, emunat hapapst. Compelled to acknowledge and contain the calendar of the majority culture. This is just one very, very brief example of every Jewish calendar, written by hand or printed. As a calendar does today, it must also be organized by the calendar of the majority society. Jews had to know and record Christian holy days that commemorated events that they found mockery or despicable. Jews incorporated an entire vocabulary of subversion into their calendars. Just to take one small example from a handwritten calendar in the 18th century, if you look at the very bottom of the first page, we're in the month of March. You see Purim, you see Shushan Purim all the way on the right side. And if you continue to look on that page on the left column, you see a notation that says Isha. March 25th is the day commemorated as the Annunciation, when the angel came to tell Mary that she had conceived a son. This is probably the shortest text, just 3 letters, Aleph Shin Hey, in the entire Pulmus Yehudi Notzri. These 3 letters let us know that at that moment, according to the Jews, Mary was no longer Betula, as she had been listed on all the other holidays. From this point and on, she is Isha. When the day to commemorate other virgins came around, the calendar notes Psula with a Pei and a Samach. All Saints' Day, Kol HaKadeshim. Saint Thomas, written in Hebrew, Tum'at, pronounced in Ashkenazic, Tumas. Christmas, in German, it's Weihnacht, but it's written out in Yiddish in the calendars as Weihnacht. Easter, Ketzach, a thorn, coats. The calendar, like the men who wrote about it, symbolize a long chain of reactions in the evolving relationship of Jews and Christians and Muslims. The Christian and Muslim calendars were created in light of the Jewish. The Jewish calendar develops strategies to resist the power of the dominant culture, and the others ultimately attempt to penetrate those strategies and eliminate them, sometimes through censorship. Beneath the often humorous double play on words, Jewish scribes were simultaneously absorbing and deflecting elements of a culture they aspired to in some respects, but rejected in others. Calendar literature, then, reflects this central paradox of Jewish existence. It embodied the need to know and to instruct in the culture of the other. Yet, precisely because it acknowledged the calendar of the other in all its intricacy, the Jewish calendar advanced strategies to counter that power. Jewish calendars and their literature engage in a balancing act between engagement and detachment. While the first impressions would indicate texts that reflect and mandate Jewish separateness, when I first came to study Luchot, I thought, here's one of the other important ways that teach us about why Jews remained separate from the majority culture. But closer inspection tells us a much more complex story of cultures so deeply intertwined they could never be completely unraveled. To conclude, calendars are a wonderful and often overlooked product of interplay between cultures. In both their elite and popular format, they provide a perfect symbolic example of the cycle of awareness and resistance, embeddedness and differentiation, which characterize the way the three religious cultures related to one another. Thank you.
תודה רבה להרצאה מרתקת מאוד של אלישבע, שמראה לנו כמה במבט בדיקה של לוחות שנה שכאילו נראים לפעמים תמימים, אנחנו יכולים לראות אותם כבמה להתכתשות בין דתות שונות, כאשר כל דת רוצה להביע את הפולמיקה שלה או את העמדות שלה מול האחרת באמצעים של שרטוט לוח השנה. ואני חושבת שיש לנו עורר מחשבות רבות ההרצאה ששמענו עכשיו, ואנחנו נוכל לשמוע כמה שאלות, נוכל לשאול בעברית, ואני חושבת שאלישבע גם תוכל לענות בעברית. נראה. אוקיי, אז אפשר לשאול בכל אופן בעברית. בבקשה.
Which culture was right about the calendar?
Nor do I have any intention to. The answer is all of the above. They're all right. Kol chevra, every society has its own way to organize time. There's no right and wrong.
There is a scientific...
There's a scientific component. Chelek mizeh is scientific. But ultimately, when does the year begin? Ze machzor, it's like a circle. Which point do you choose? It's a cultural choice. What is important to each society is something that's a value decision. There is no right and wrong in so many things. And that's why they're all right and they're all wrong.
באיזה מידה, מעניין אותי מאוד, שקודם כל תודה על ההרצאה באמת מרתק, נושא מרתק. רציתי לשאול באיזה מידה הוויכוח הזה, ההתחבטות הזאת, מה לקבל, מה לדחות, היא משקפת את חיי היום-יום, כי הרי יהודים היו צריכים לחיות בתוך לוח השנה הזה. בסופו של דבר הייתה דומיננטיות, אם אנחנו חושבים על מקומות שבהם גם וגם, מוסלמים תחת שלטון, או יהודים תחת שלטון נוצרי ותחת שלטון מוסלמי. איך באמת משקף את המציאות החיי היום-יום ולידי ביטוי את הקשיים שחוו יהודים במאמץ הזה של חיים תחת שלטון, סדר חיים.
את יכולה לענות את זה אפילו היום. כמה אנשים בישראל היום מעגנים את הלוח שלהם לפי הלוח היהודי וכמה לפי הלוח המערבי? אינני יודעת, אבל אני חושבת, I think that the last area of colonialism by the West is in time. Even in places like China, where they hate the West, they are beginning to use the Western calendar. זאת אומרת שזה it's a central aspect of existence of any minority culture at any time. זה תמיד היה שם, it always exerted a tremendous influence. And that's why what I showed you in the last picture was some Jewish man's private calendar שהוא כתב לעצמו. And you could see in it, he had to know every Christian holiday, but he wanted to reassure himself that just by acknowledging its existence, he's not accepting its values. And that's a very delicate balance.
The Ottoman calendar is very interesting. I mean, I don't exactly know where it's coming from. Obviously, you pulled it out as a polemic. I won't say it's not a polemic.
No, I pulled it out as an example, actually, of the larger tolerance of the Ottoman Empire, which, unlike so many of the early Islamic attempts to impose discipline on Islamic society, here you see a very pragmatic and practical approach in which all the different calendars are listed, because this is primarily for commerce, to enable different commercial circles to work with one another. So it lists them all, and in my, again, very, very poor knowledge of Jewish literature written in that period, the early modern period in the Ottoman Empire, you don't find anti-Islamic calendar polemic because it was such a inclusive calendar.
I mean, it's showing the diversity. Okay, you even have two different versions of Greek Orthodoxy there. Okay, you have everything listed, and you'll never see a calendar like that. Usually, it would have two cycles.
No. A Jewish calendar from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. If you're a merchant who's going, say, from Poland to the Ottoman Empire to Western Europe, had to have at least 5 or 6 calendars. And this, so this is not just the Ottoman.
What I wanted to say, it looks pretty. I mean, obviously in this period the Catholics.
What's the question?
I want to show there's a paradox. There's more compatibility between the faiths here and the calendaric traditions, whereas the Jews in Hellenism and the early Christians had bitter disputes over the calendar and their calendars and the lunar cycle, etc., etc. Here it's like everyone's respecting the other tradition. And what's significant amongst not Western Catholicism, but Eastern Orthodoxy, they're copying in their life cycle the Jewish calendar. Okay, and you can't see it from the calendar, but that in their life cycle, like, they won't have Easter until the Jews have Passover. And if it's a leap year, they'll wait another month. That's like one example.
Okay. I accept your point.
יש לנו את אורח, ואחר כך
רציתי להגיד רק שהוויכוח הזה לא נגמר עם הקמת מדינת ישראל, וכולנו קראנו השבוע על האיסור לשים עצי אשוח בבתי מלון, כן, של הרבנות בישראל, שאחר כך ירדו מזה כשאמרו להם שמה יקרה אם בחוץ לארץ יאסרו לשים חנוכיות בבתי מלון, ולהזכיר את המנהג היהודי בגולה, לקרוא בערב חג המולד את ספר תולדות ישו שאת בבקשה.
אני מתנצל שאני שואל שאלה. האם יש קשר בין קביעת תחילת השנה היהודית בתחילת תשרי ליחסים עם הדתות האחרות?
יש גם פולמוס על לא כל כך מתי להתחיל את השנה, שאתה יודע שגם בתלמוד ניסן יש 4 ראשי שנה, זה לא רק אחד. אז זה
דברים אחרים, אבל ראש השנה לשנים הוא תחילת תשרי.
כן, אבל זה היה תוצאה של פולמוס שאנחנו רק שומעים הדים ממנה במשנה ובתלמוד. אני לא יודעת בדיוק על מה הם היו, אבל זה היה in antiquities. זה כבר לא עניין של נצרות באסלאם. אבל מה שכן הוא מאוד מעניין זה התאריך הכרונולוגי. מתי מתחילים לספור שנה אחת? אוקיי? היהודים לא תמיד מנעו מבריאת עולם.
כן, יש לפי השטרות.
כן, זה היה יווני. אז למה שינו את זה? ומתי? ומי עשה את זה? אנחנו לא יודעים. אני חושבת שבערך במאה השישי, שביעי, משהו כזה, כשהלוח הנוצרי הפך from the Caesar calendar של הרומאים ללוח שמתחיל, לכרונולוגיה שמתחילה באנו דומיני. That didn't happen till around the 6th or 7th century. היהודים לא יכולים לספור עם אותם with that chronology. And that's בדיוק אותו זמן שהאסלאם גם התחילה a different counting, which is very, very rooted in religion. זה לא עניין של שטרות, זה עניין של הדת. So Jews couldn't use ספירה נוצרית, and they couldn't use ספירה מוסלמית, and therefore they began to use the ספירה לבריאת עולם, which is rooted in סדר עולם, but was never used before the 7th century as a chronology.
עוד שאלה אחת. בבקשה.
I wanted to know about the pictures. Are many of the calendars illustrated with pictures, more Jewish, Christian, or
Okay, good question. I'll answer very briefly. The calendars that you use for a year, Luach Kis, Luach Kir, are the cheapest printed things available. They generally don't have illustrations. They're intended to be thrown away. But Sifrei Ibur and the Computus manuscripts in Latin, which are intended to teach how to set the calendar, these were illustrated. Think about Christian books of hours also that intend to fill time with a deeply religious dimension. So that's the difference.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.